Thanksgiving is supposed to be a day of gathering, a day when families make plans, prepare food, travel across town or across the country to sit around the same table. But on Thanksgiving Day in 2018, something happened in Woodland Park, Colorado, that would turn an ordinary holiday into the beginning of a devastating mystery. That morning, 29-year-old Kelsey Berreth spoke with her mother, Cheryl. There was nothing, at least from Cheryl's perspective, to suggest that anything was terribly wrong. Kelsey sounded normal. She sounded happy. And that detail will become painfully important later, because Kelsey had no idea that this would be one of the last conversations her mother would ever have with her. By the time the day was over, Kelsey would have vanished. Her daughter, just 1 year old, would be without her mother. And for more than a week, the people who loved Kelsey would have no idea where she was. The last publicly known images of Kelsey came from surveillance cameras at a Safeway grocery store in Woodland Park. There she was, carrying out what looked like one of the most ordinary errands imaginable. She was shopping with her little daughter. She pushed a cart through the store. She bought groceries. Among the items were ingredients for a sweet potato casserole. And then, at some point, she sent a message to her fiancé, Patrick Frazee. The message was simple. She had bought sweet potatoes in case he wanted sweet potato casserole. It was a kind of text that, at first glance, seemed completely unremarkable. But after Kelsey disappeared, that message took on a different meaning, because Patrick would eventually tell investigators that he and Kelsey had separated around Thanksgiving. Yet Kelsey's behavior that day did not immediately resemble someone preparing to walk away from a relationship. She was shopping. She was making plans. She was thinking about Thanksgiving food. And most importantly, she was thinking about her family. She was also a mother whose 1-year-old daughter was with her that day. Later, Kelsey would drop her daughter off with Patrick. That would be the last time anyone outside the family of the accused would publicly see her alive. And then she was gone. At first, there was no immediate alarm. Kelsey's family did not know that anything had happened. They had no reason to imagine that a young woman who had spoken happily with her mother that morning would soon become the center of a massive missing person investigation. Days passed, then more days, and Kelsey didn't call. She didn't come home. She didn't show up for work. Her family began to worry, because Kelsey was not known for simply disappearing. She had a career. She had a daughter. She had parents who loved her. She had responsibilities. She had a life. And that life had suddenly stopped. When Cheryl Berreth finally reported her daughter missing on December 2nd, she was not reporting the disappearance of someone who had a history of running away. She was reporting the disappearance of a woman whose behavior was completely out of character. And the more investigators looked at the circumstances surrounding Kelsey's disappearance, the more troubling the picture became. Her car was still there. Her belongings were still there. Her clothes were still there. Her toothbrush was still there, and there were signs that Kelsey had expected to continue living her ordinary life. Yet she wasn't there. Then investigators discovered something even stranger. Kelsey's phone had apparently traveled hundreds of miles away from Colorado. 3 days after she vanished, the phone was being used in a way that suggested Kelsey was still alive. Messages were sent. Her employer received communication indicating that she would not be coming to work. But investigators would eventually discover that Kelsey herself had not sent those messages. Someone else had her phone. Someone else was trying to create the appearance that Kelsey had simply left. And suddenly, the question changed. This was no longer simply, where is Kelsey Berreth? The question became, who wanted the world to believe she was somewhere she wasn't, and why? The answer would eventually lead investigators into a story of betrayal, deception, manipulation, and a relationship that had been hiding secrets from the people closest to it. At the center of that story was Patrick Frazee, the father of Kelsey's daughter and the man to whom she was engaged. But there was another person, a woman who lived hundreds of miles away, a nurse from Idaho named Crystal Lee Kenney. And according to the case presented at trial, Crystal was connected to Patrick in a way Kelsey had never fully understood. What investigators would eventually learn was that Kelsey's disappearance had not been an isolated event. It was the final chapter of a much longer story. A story that involved a relationship under strain, a custody conflict, a secret affair, allegations that Kelsey was a bad mother, plans that, according to prosecutors and testimony at trial, were made against her, and a series of decisions that would ultimately lead to Kelsey losing her life. But to understand how Kelsey Berreth ended up dead, we have to go back, before the missing person posters, before the police investigation, before the courtroom, before Thanksgiving became the day that changed everything. We have to go back to the woman Kelsey was before she became a name in a murder case. Because Kelsey Berreth was more than the circumstances of her death. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, a professional with ambitions, a young mother, and to the little girl she left behind, she was simply Mom. And that is where this story really begins. Kelsey Berreth was 29 years old when her life came to a tragic end. But if you only know her from the headlines, it can be easy to forget that before the crime, before the investigation, before the trial, an entire person was living an ordinary life. Kelsey had grown up in Washington State, in and around the Moses Lake area. Her childhood was shaped by an environment where hard work and independence were part of everyday life. She wasn't someone whose life appeared destined to become a national news story. She was a young woman with a career she cared deeply about and a future she was still building. One of the things that made Kelsey stand out was her passion for aviation. As a young girl, she had watched planes flying over the farmland around her home. For many people, a plane passing overhead is just part of scenery. For Kelsey, it became a dream. She wanted to fly, and she didn't simply talk about that dream. She pursued it. Kelsey eventually trained as a pilot and became a flight instructor. By the time she was living in Colorado, she had built a professional life around aviation and was working as a flight instructor at DOS Aviation in Pueblo. It was a demanding career. The job required knowledge, discipline, patience, and responsibility. She wasn't simply teaching people how to operate an aircraft. She was helping train aspiring military pilots. The people who worked with her knew her as a professional, someone who took her work seriously, someone who had built something for herself. And then there was another role that had become even more important: motherhood. Kelsey's daughter, Kaylee, was born in October 2017. She arrived prematurely and spent time in a neonatal intensive care unit. For Kelsey's family, the arrival of that little girl was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. And for Kelsey, motherhood became central to her life. She was not simply building a career anymore. She was raising a child, planning for the future, trying to balance the responsibilities of work with the demands of being a mother. And those responsibilities were not always easy. Kelsey's work was in Pueblo, while she lived in Woodland Park. That meant a significant commute. And after giving birth, she was navigating the exhausting reality familiar to many working parents, trying to maintain a career while caring for a young child. But those close to Kelsey said she loved being a mother. Her daughter was part of the life she was building. And that is important to remember when looking at what happened later. Because the tragedy of Kelsey's death wasn't only that a 29-year-old woman was killed. It was that a young mother was taken from a child who was still far too young to understand what had happened. Kelsey's daughter was only 1 year old when her mother disappeared. She was too young to understand the news reports, too young to understand the police investigation, too young to understand why her mother's face was suddenly appearing on posters and television screens. And eventually, she would grow up with a question that could never be answered ordinarily: where is my mother? For Kelsey's parents, the disappearance was equally devastating. Cheryl Berreth was one of the people who knew her daughter best. And when Kelsey stopped communicating, Cheryl knew something was wrong. Kelsey wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without explanation. She had a job. She had a child. She had a family. She had a home. She had a routine. People were expecting to hear from her. People would notice if she didn't show up. So when those days passed without contact, Kelsey's absence became impossible to explain away. And then came the heartbreaking realization that her family would eventually have to confront. The daughter they were desperately searching for might never be coming home. But at the beginning, they didn't know that. They still hoped. They still searched. They still believed that there had to be an explanation. That hope is one of the cruelest parts of a missing person case. Because when someone disappears, the people who love them are trapped between two impossible possibilities. They want to believe the person is alive, but every unanswered question makes that hope harder to sustain. In Kelsey's case, the circumstances were especially confusing. The last known images of her showed a woman doing something completely ordinary. She was grocery shopping with her young daughter. There was no obvious sign of panic, no public confrontation, no indication that she was about to disappear. And earlier that morning, she had spoken with her mother. She sounded happy. That was what Cheryl remembered. Happy, normal. And then there was the Thanksgiving meal. Kelsey had bought the ingredients for sweet potato casserole. She even sent Patrick a message about it. That small detail became one of the most haunting pieces of the case. Because when investigators later tried to understand what happened to Kelsey, they had to look at the decisions she made that day. Why was she shopping? Why was she making plans? Why was she talking about Thanksgiving food? Why was she communicating with Patrick as though the relationship between them was still functioning normally? And if Kelsey really had been planning to leave or had already ended the relationship, as Patrick would later suggest, why was she behaving as though there were still ordinary family plans? The answers to those questions would become part of a much darker picture, because behind the seemingly ordinary life Kelsey was living, there were tensions that her family and friends did not fully understand. Her relationship with Patrick Frazee was complicated. The two had a daughter together. They were engaged, but they did not live together. And according to evidence later presented in court, their relationship had become increasingly strained. There were disagreements. There were concerns about their future. And most importantly, there were questions about their daughter. Kelsey was a mother who wanted to protect her child. Patrick was the child's father. And as their relationship deteriorated, the question of what would happen to their daughter became increasingly important. Kelsey's parents later alleged that Patrick wanted greater control over their daughter, and that disagreements over custody contributed to the motive for the killing. That claim was part of a later wrongful death lawsuit and should be understood as an allegation rather than a fact. But whatever the precise motive, what is clear is that Kelsey's relationship with Patrick had become a critical part of the story. And there was something else Kelsey did not know. Patrick had another relationship, a secret one, and that relationship would eventually become one of the most important threads in the entire investigation. Her name was Crystal Lee Kenney. Crystal lived in Idaho. She was a nurse, and she had known Patrick for years. According to testimony later presented in court, the relationship between Patrick and Crystal was not simply a causal connection. It was an emotional relationship that had continued, in one form or another, for a long time. And Kelsey was largely unaware of the full extent of it. That meant Patrick was living within two different worlds. In one world, he was Kelsey's fiancé, the father of her daughter, the man who was supposed to be part of the future she was building. In another, he was maintaining a secret relationship with another woman. And as the investigation would eventually reveal, that hidden relationship would become directly connected to the events that led to Kelsey's death. But there was an even more disturbing development. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick had begun portraying Kelsey as a threat. He allegedly told Crystal that Kelsey was abusive toward their daughter. He allegedly presented himself as a father who needed protection from the mother of his child. These claims became a crucial part of the prosecution's narrative. Because if Patrick was trying to convince another woman that Kelsey was dangerous, then the question becomes, was he trying to create a justification for what he already intended to do, or was he manipulating Crystal into believing that Kelsey's death was somehow necessary? Either way, the result was devastating, because Kelsey was no longer simply living her life. Unbeknownst to her, she had become the central figure in a secret conflict, a conflict involving a man she was engaged to, a woman she barely knew, and a series of alleged murder plots that, according to Crystal's testimony, came before the final attack. There were opportunities for someone to intervene. There were moments when the chain of events could have been broken, but they weren't. And that is what makes Kelsey's story so painful. The tragedy did not appear out of nowhere on Thanksgiving Day. According to the evidence presented in court, it was a culmination of a series of decisions. decisions made by people around her, decisions Kelsey could not see coming. By November 2018, Kelsey was still living a life that, from the outside, looked ordinary. She was working. She was raising her daughter. She was communicating with her family. And on Thanksgiving morning, she spoke with her mother. She sounded happy. Then she went shopping. She bought food. She spent time with her daughter. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary day, the future Kelsey believed she was living was about to disappear. The woman seen on that grocery store surveillance footage did not know that the world would soon be searching for her. She did not know that investigators would eventually reconstruct her final hours piece by piece. She did not know that her family would be forced to live with years of unanswered questions. And she could not have known that the man who was the father of her child and the man she was engaged to would eventually be convicted of her murder. For Kelsey, Thanksgiving 2018 began like any other family holiday, but it would end with her disappearance. And in the days that followed, the people who loved her would begin a desperate search for answers. They would soon discover that Kelsey's disappearance was not what it appeared to be. And the first clue that something much darker had happened would come from the very people who were supposed to know where she was. Because while Kelsey's family was waiting for her to come home, someone was already trying to make it look as though she had simply chosen to leave. And that was when the search for Kelsey Berreth became something far more sinister. To understand what happened to Kelsey Berreth, investigators had to look closely at the relationship at the center of her life. Her relationship with Patrick Frazee. On the surface, their connection seemed to fit the picture of a young couple building a family together. Kelsey was a pilot and flight instructor. Patrick was a rancher. Their lifestyles were different, but there were similarities too. Both were comfortable around the outdoors. Both had connections to rural communities. And both seemed to understand the kind of life that came with living outside the larger cities. Eventually, their relationship became serious. And then came the most important connection of all, their daughter. In October 2017, Kelsey gave birth to a baby girl. For Kelsey, becoming a mother changed everything. Her daughter was no longer simply part of her future. She was her future. Every decision now carried a different weight. Work, home, relationships, where she lived, who she trusted, the kind of environment in which her daughter would grow up. But the arrival of their child also created a permanent bond between Kelsey and Patrick. Even if their romantic relationship eventually ended, they would always be connected through their daughter. And that connection would later become one of the most important and painful elements of the case. Because by the time Kelsey disappeared, she and Patrick were no longer living together. They were engaged, but their relationship was complicated. Their lives were increasingly separate. Kelsey lived in Woodland Park. Patrick lived on or near his family's ranch in Florissant. And despite their engagement, the two did not appear to be building a conventional shared household. Instead, Kelsey was often the one traveling to see Patrick. She was also managing a demanding career. Her job as a flight instructor required her to commute to Pueblo, while she was simultaneously caring for a young child. It was a difficult schedule, and like many relationships under pressure, theirs was affected by the realities of everyday life. There were disagreements. There were tensions. And according to people who knew Kelsey, the relationship was not always easy. Kelsey had responsibilities that extended far beyond her relationship with Patrick. She had her career. She had her daughter. And she had her family. Those who knew her described her as someone who was deeply committed to her child. So when disagreements arose between Kelsey and Patrick, the future of their daughter was inevitably part of the equation. According to testimony and later legal claims, custody was one of the areas where tensions developed. Kelsey's parents would eventually allege that Patrick wanted more control over their daughter, and that disagreements surrounding custody contributed to the circumstances leading to Kelsey's death. Those claims were made in subsequent litigation and should be understood as allegations. But regardless of the precise nature of their disagreements, one fact remained. Kelsey and Patrick's relationship was no longer as simple as it might have appeared from the outside. They were engaged, they had a daughter, but they were not living together, and there were unresolved problems between them. Then there was another complication, one that Kelsey did not fully know about. Patrick had a past, and that past included a woman named Crystal Lee Kenney. Long before Kelsey Berreth disappeared, Patrick Frazee had known Crystal Kenney. Crystal was from Idaho. She had grown up around horses and rodeo culture, and that shared background was part of what initially drew her to Patrick. The two met in 2006, when Crystal was around 20 years old. At the time, Crystal was balancing nursing school with several part-time jobs. Her life was busy. She was young. She was building a future. And then she met Patrick. The attraction was immediate. Crystal became deeply invested in the relationship. According to the account later presented in court, she made repeated trips between Idaho and Colorado to see him. The distance did not seem to matter. She would drive for hours to spend time with him. They spoke frequently, sometimes every day. For Crystal, Patrick appeared to represent something familiar: the ranch, the horses, the rural lifestyle, the kind of environment she had grown up around. But the relationship was not always stable. Patrick's attention could be intense. Then it could disappear. There were periods when they were close and periods when communication became distant. Crystal's feelings, however, remained. And according to her later testimony, that emotional attachment would continue for years, even when their relationship ended, even when Crystal moved forward with her own life, even when she eventually married another man. Patrick never completely disappeared from her emotional world, and that would become critical, because while Kelsey was building a life with Patrick, Crystal was still somewhere in the background, a hidden connection, a relationship that Kelsey did not fully understand, and one that Patrick could return to whenever circumstances allowed. Over the years, Crystal's relationship with Patrick followed a pattern. They would reconnect. They would become emotionally close. Then something would happen, and the relationship would fall apart again. At one point, Crystal began dating Chad Lee. Eventually, she became engaged to him, and in July 2010, Crystal and Chad were engaged to be married. The wedding was scheduled for the following day, but the night before the wedding, Crystal received a voicemail. It was from Patrick. According to testimony, he asked her not to go through with the marriage. He told her that he should have come to rescue her. Crystal did not call him back. The next day, she married Chad, but later, she acknowledged that she still had feelings for Patrick. That detail would become important years later, because Patrick had not simply been an old boyfriend. He was someone who had remained emotionally significant to Crystal for more than a decade, and Patrick appeared to understand that. He knew where she was vulnerable. He knew she had never completely let go. And when the two eventually reconnected, that old emotional bond was still there. In 2015, during a difficult period in Crystal's marriage, she reached out to Patrick. The connection came back quickly. What had been dormant suddenly became active again. They began talking regularly. Then, according to testimony, their relationship became sexual. And once again, Patrick became a major part of Crystal's emotional life. But there was a problem. Patrick was not single. He was involved with Kelsey. And by this point, his relationship with Kelsey had developed into something serious. They had a child. They were engaged. And yet Patrick was maintaining a secret connection with Crystal. This was the beginning of a dangerous triangle. Kelsey did not know the full story. Crystal did not know everything about Kelsey. And Patrick was positioned between the two women. One was the mother of his child. The other was a woman who had loved him for years and still believed there might be a future between them. And according to the evidence later presented in court, Patrick appeared to keep both relationships alive in different ways. To Crystal, he reportedly suggested that she was the person he had always wanted, the one who had gotten away. To Kelsey, he remained her fiancé and the father of her daughter, but there was a critical difference. Kelsey did not know that Crystal was still in Patrick's life. Crystal did not know the full extent of Patrick's relationship with Kelsey, and Patrick was the person controlling the flow of information between them. That gave him enormous power. He could tell one woman something the other didn't know. He could present himself differently to each, and he could maintain two separate versions of his life. For years, that arrangement remained hidden until something changed. In early 2016, Crystal believed she was pregnant. According to her later testimony, she believed Patrick was a father, The pregnancy placed her in an impossible emotional position. She was married, she had a complicated relationship with Patrick, and she was uncertain about what their future actually looked like. She turned to Patrick for guidance. But according to Crystal's account, his response was not what she expected. She testified that Patrick told her she was either a baby killer or she wasn't. Crystal interpreted those words as pressure to end the pregnancy. She ultimately had an abortion. She later told Patrick that she had miscarried. It was another secret added to an already complicated relationship. And by May 2016, Crystal had filed for divorce from Chad. But the relationship with Patrick did not become the stable future she may have imagined. Instead, their communication eventually went silent. For roughly a year and a half, the connection between them appeared to disappear. But while Crystal was out of Patrick's life, another woman was becoming increasingly important to him. Her name was Kelsey Berreth, and Patrick's relationship with Kelsey was developing into the relationship that would ultimately lead to the birth of his daughter. At almost the same time that Crystal's relationship with Patrick was fading into silence, Kelsey was becoming part of his everyday world. Crystal had no idea what was happening, and Kelsey had no idea that Patrick's former lover would eventually return. By 2017, Patrick's life with Kelsey looked very different from his life with Crystal. He was now a father. Kelsey had given birth to their daughter. The couple was engaged, and from the outside, Patrick appeared to be building a family. But the relationship was complicated by the fact that Kelsey and Patrick did not live together. Kelsey continued to manage her career and motherhood. Patrick continued living his life on the ranch. And as time passed, cracks began to appear. Friends of Kelsey later described concerns about the relationship. One of her close friends, Ashley Cogburn, reportedly believed Kelsey was struggling emotionally. According to Cogburn, Patrick could be critical and difficult to please. Kelsey, despite being an accomplished professional and a woman who had demonstrated independence throughout her life, could become upset by the things Patrick said. Her friend described moments when Kelsey would cry. The relationship, according to those who knew her, appeared to be taking an emotional toll, but Kelsey stayed. And that is an important part of understanding what happened next, because relationships are rarely as simple from the inside as they appear from the outside. People don't stay in difficult relationships because they don't understand that they're difficult. They stay for complicated reasons. Love, hope, children, history, the belief that things can improve, the belief that the person they love could become the person they once hoped they would be. And Kelsey had another reason to try to make things work. Her daughter. Whatever disagreements existed between Kelsey and Patrick, they were now permanently connected by their child. Kelsey had to think not only about herself. She had to think about what was best for her daughter, and that meant continuing to navigate a complicated relationship with the father of her child. Meanwhile, Patrick's past was beginning to return. In October 2017, around the time Kelsey gave birth to their daughter, Patrick reached out to Crystal. After roughly a year and a half of silence, he contacted her again. The message was casual. He asked whether she still liked children. Crystal responded, and the two began talking. What Crystal did not know was that Patrick was now engaged. He had a newborn daughter, and he was building a family with another woman. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick did not immediately tell her. Instead, the relationship resumed. Crystal was thrilled to have Patrick back in her life. To her, it may have felt like something unfinished had finally returned, but she was walking into a situation she did not fully understand. Patrick had a fiancée. Patrick had a newborn daughter. And Patrick had an entire life in Colorado that Crystal knew little about. Yet the emotional connection between them quickly became strong again. By 2018, Crystal was visiting Colorado. She spent time with Patrick. She helped with horses. She participated in activities connected to his ranching lifestyle. But she was unaware that the woman she would eventually become obsessed with was already living a completely different reality. Kelsey was Patrick's fiancée. She was the mother of his child, and she was living in Colorado. Crystal was the secret. And then, eventually, Crystal discovered the truth. The revelation came gradually. Crystal began noticing small details. During one visit, She reportedly encountered evidence that Patrick had a child. At first, the clues were subtle. A baby wipe, a photograph, a comment, things that didn't make sense until they were put together. Then someone casually mentioned that Patrick had a daughter. Crystal was stunned, because Patrick had not told her. The man she had loved for more than a decade had been keeping an enormous part of his life from her. He wasn't simply dating someone. He was engaged. He had a baby. He was a father. And the woman at the center of that life was Kelsey Berreth. By August 2018, Crystal confronted Patrick. She told him, "I know." Patrick could no longer pretend. Crystal now knew about Kelsey. She knew about the child, and she knew that Patrick had been keeping her in the dark. This should have been the moment when everything stopped, the moment when Crystal walked away, the moment when she recognized that the relationship she had spent years emotionally investing in was not the future she believed it could be. But according to her later testimony, that did not happen. Instead, Patrick began telling Crystal a new story. And this story would change everything. Patrick allegedly began portraying Kelsey as a danger, not as the woman he had chosen to build a family with, not simply as his fiancée, but as someone who was supposedly harming their daughter. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick told her stories about Kelsey's parenting. He allegedly described incidents involving the child being injured, claims about a baby gate, claims about a hand being caught in a refrigerator door. The allegations were serious, but investigators found no supporting evidence that Kelsey had abused her daughter. And that distinction matters, because Patrick was telling Crystal a story in which he was a concerned father, a story in which Kelsey was a problem, and a story in which Crystal could become the person who helped him. According to prosecutors, this was manipulation. Patrick had a complicated history with Crystal. He knew she still loved him. He knew she had wanted a future with him. And now he was presenting himself as a man trapped in a dangerous situation, a father who needed help, a man whose child needed protection. And according to Crystal's testimony, Patrick's story gradually transformed Kelsey from a person into an obstacle. Crystal began to see Kelsey not as another human being with a life, a family, and a child, but as the person standing between her and Patrick. That psychological shift would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, because before Kelsey was killed, she had allegedly been targeted in another way. She had been turned into an enemy in someone else's mind. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick eventually began discussing ways Kelsey could be killed. The first plan allegedly involved Kelsey's favorite Starbucks drink, a caramel macchiato. Patrick allegedly knew what she liked. And according to Crystal, the conversation turned toward using her medical knowledge to help introduce something harmful into the drink. Crystal was a nurse. She understood medications. She understood substances. And according to prosecutors, Patrick was attempting to use that knowledge against Kelsey. But the plan did not happen. Crystal traveled to Colorado in September 2018. She brought a relative with her who, according to the case, had no idea what Crystal was actually involved in. Crystal then went to Kelsey's townhouse. She was carrying coffee, and for the first time, the two women were standing face to face. Kelsey had no idea who she was really talking to. She did not know that the woman standing at her door had a secret relationship with her fiancé. She did not know that this woman had been discussing her death. She did not know that the man she was engaged to had allegedly been trying to convince Crystal that she was dangerous. Kelsey simply spoke with her, and according to Crystal's account, she did not poison the coffee. She left, but that wasn't the end. According to her testimony, another plan was discussed. Then another. One allegedly involved a metal pipe. Another involved a baseball bat. And each time, Crystal had an opportunity to stop. She could have gone to the police. She could have warned Kelsey. She could have told Kelsey's family. She could have told someone. But she didn't. And that is where the story becomes morally complicated. Because Crystal would later describe herself as someone who had been manipulated by Patrick. And there is evidence that Patrick had exerted emotional influence over her for years. But the court ultimately held her responsible for her own actions. She had opportunities to intervene, and she chose not to. By the fall of 2018, the situation had reached a dangerous point. Patrick had allegedly convinced Crystal that Kelsey was a threat. Crystal had already traveled to Colorado. She had already gone to Kelsey's home. She had already been exposed to discussions about murder. And yet Kelsey continued living her life, going to work, raising her daughter, speaking with her mother, making plans. She had no idea that the people around her were moving toward a decision that would destroy her family. As November 2018 approached, Kelsey was still living her life. There was no public announcement that she and Patrick were separating, no dramatic confrontation that the world could see, no warning that would immediately make people realize something terrible was about to happen. Instead, life continued. Kelsey worked. She cared for her daughter. She communicated with her family. And she prepared for Thanksgiving. That is perhaps what makes the final days so haunting. The crime was not committed in the middle of chaos. Kelsey's final known hours were surrounded by ordinary moments. A conversation with her mother, a trip to the grocery store, a message about sweet potatoes, a mother spending time with her young daughter. These were the last pieces of Kelsey's life that investigators could clearly see. But underneath that normality was a hidden reality. Patrick had allegedly been discussing Kelsey's death. Crystal had already been drawn into those discussions. And according to the prosecution, the relationship between the two had reached a point where Kelsey's survival had become an obstacle to the future Patrick wanted. The evidence would later suggest that Patrick had been thinking about killing Kelsey before Thanksgiving. But whatever plans existed before that day, Kelsey herself was unaware. She had no reason to believe that the man who was the father of her child was preparing to become the person accused of taking her life. And that brings us back to Thanksgiving. November 22nd, 2018. Kelsey woke up that morning as a mother, as a daughter, as a professional, as a woman with a future. She spoke to her mother. She went shopping. She spent time with her child. She thought about Thanksgiving dinner. She was living in the present. But somewhere else, the circumstances surrounding her life were moving toward a devastating end. And when Kelsey disappeared, investigators would eventually discover that the answer wasn't simply hidden in the days after Thanksgiving. It was hidden in the relationships that had been developing for years. In Patrick's relationship with Kelsey, in Patrick's secret relationship with Crystal, and in the increasingly dangerous story Patrick had allegedly told Crystal about the mother of his child, because the investigation would ultimately reveal something chilling. Kelsey's death was not simply the result of one sudden argument or one moment of uncontrolled anger. According to the prosecution's case, it was a culmination of a series of choices: a secret relationship, a hidden life, a woman who believed she was being asked to save a child, and a man who, prosecutors argued, had convinced her that the mother of his child had to be removed. But Kelsey was still alive. She was still making plans. And she was still completely unaware of what was coming, until Thanksgiving Day. And after that day, the people who loved Kelsey would begin searching for her, while Patrick would begin telling a story about where she had gone. And Crystal would be left carrying a secret that she could no longer keep buried. The investigation was about to begin. And slowly, investigators would discover that the most important evidence wasn't necessarily where Kelsey had gone. It was who had been trying to make everyone believe she had left on her own. By the fall of 2018, the relationship between Kelsey Berreth and Patrick Frazee had reached a complicated and increasingly fragile point. From the outside, they were still connected by the things that mattered most. They had a daughter, they were engaged, and their lives were permanently intertwined. But behind that connection, the relationship was becoming increasingly difficult. Kelsey was living in Woodland Park with their young daughter, while Patrick lived at his family's ranch in Florissant. Their arrangement meant that even though they were engaged, they were not sharing the same home. Kelsey was also trying to balance the demands of motherhood with her career as a flight instructor. She had a long commute to work in Pueblo, and caring for a young child required constant planning. There were schedules to coordinate, childcare arrangements, work responsibilities, and the complicated question of how two parents who were no longer functioning as a conventional couple would raise their daughter. According to people close to Kelsey, the relationship had become emotionally difficult. One of Kelsey's friends, Ashley Cogburn, later described concerns about the way Patrick treated her. The prosecution's case included allegations that Patrick was emotionally manipulative and that Kelsey's confidence had been affected by the relationship. But the most important thing to understand is that Kelsey was still trying to navigate the relationship. She wasn't living as though she had completely cut Patrick out of her life. And she couldn't simply do that. He was the father of her child. Whatever happened between them, Patrick would remain part of Kelsey's life because of their daughter. That made the situation more complicated than a simple breakup. If Kelsey was unhappy, she still had to think about co-parenting. If Patrick was unhappy, he still had to maintain a relationship with the mother of his child. And if there were disagreements about their daughter, those disagreements could not simply be avoided. According to allegations later made by Kelsey's family, custody and parenting disagreements were among the tensions that developed between the couple. Those claims were disputed and later became part of civil litigation, but they provide important context for understanding the atmosphere surrounding the relationship. The couple's daughter was at the center of everything, and according to the prosecution's case, Patrick eventually began using concerns about the child as a way of portraying Kelsey as someone who needed to be removed from their lives. That would become a crucial turning point, because the woman Patrick was allegedly trying to convince was not a stranger. She was someone who had loved him for years, someone who had remained emotionally connected to him despite long periods of separation, someone who, according to her own testimony, still had feelings for him. Her name was Crystal Lee Kenney, and by late 2018, Crystal had become deeply entangled in Patrick's life. For years, Patrick and Crystal had maintained a complicated on-again, off-again relationship. Their connection had started long before Kelsey entered Patrick's life. It had survived distance, other relationships, marriage, separation, and long periods of silence. Crystal had never completely let go of Patrick, and Patrick appeared to know that. When he returned to her life after becoming involved with Kelsey, the relationship resumed. But this time, there was a major difference. Patrick was no longer simply a former boyfriend. He was engaged. He was a father. And he was building a life with another woman. Crystal did not initially know the full extent of that life. When she eventually discovered that Patrick had a daughter and was engaged to Kelsey, she confronted him. According to her later testimony, Patrick responded by portraying his relationship with Kelsey in a way that made Crystal feel there was still a future for the two of them. But the situation was more complicated than that. Patrick was not simply trying to leave a relationship. According to the prosecution, he was allegedly trying to eliminate the person he viewed as standing in his way. And that is where the story takes a darker turn. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick began telling her disturbing things about Kelsey. He allegedly claimed that Kelsey was a bad mother. He allegedly described situations in which their daughter had supposedly been harmed. Investigators later found no evidence supporting the allegations that Kelsey had abused her daughter. But according to prosecutors, Patrick's claims had a powerful effect on Crystal. The story he allegedly told her created a completely different image of Kelsey. Instead of seeing Kelsey as the woman Patrick had chosen to build a family with, Crystal was encouraged to see her as a threat, someone dangerous, someone who was supposedly hurting a child. And Patrick, according to the prosecution, positioned himself as the person who needed to rescue that child. It was a narrative that appealed directly to Crystal's emotions. She was a mother herself. She was a nurse. She understood the responsibility of caring for vulnerable people. And according to her testimony, she believed Patrick was telling her the truth. But there was another layer to the situation. Crystal was emotionally attached to Patrick. She had spent years hoping that their relationship might eventually become something permanent. Now, suddenly, Patrick was back in her life, and he was telling her that the woman standing between them was supposedly dangerous. Whether Patrick genuinely believed his own claims or was deliberately manipulating Crystal became one of the central questions surrounding the case. But whatever his motivation, the effect was devastating. According to prosecutors, the idea of Kelsey as an obstacle began to take hold, and then Patrick allegedly crossed a line. He began talking about killing her. According to investigators and Crystal's later testimony, Patrick's plans to kill Kelsey began as early as September 2018. This was not, according to prosecution, a single impulsive decision made on Thanksgiving, The prosecution argued that Patrick had been thinking about killing Kelsey for months. And according to the affidavit in the case, he allegedly approached Crystal repeatedly, asking her to help. The first alleged plan involved Kelsey's coffee. Kelsey reportedly had a favorite Starbucks drink, a caramel macchiato. Patrick allegedly knew this. And according to Crystal, he proposed using her nursing knowledge to help put something harmful into the drink. The details of the alleged plan were deeply disturbing. But what mattered most to investigators was not simply the method. It was the fact that, according to Crystal, Patrick was already thinking about Kelsey's death long before Thanksgiving. He was allegedly trying to recruit someone else to do it, and that person was Crystal. But Crystal did not carry out the plan. Instead, she hesitated. She backed away, and the plan failed. For Patrick, however, the idea did not disappear. According to the evidence presented at trial, he allegedly continued searching for another way. The next alleged plan was more direct. Patrick reportedly discussed attacking Kelsey with a metal pipe. Again, Crystal was allegedly drawn into the conversation. According to her account, Patrick wanted her to participate. The idea was not simply theoretical. Crystal had already traveled to Colorado. She had already been physically close to Kelsey's home. And according to investigators, she was now being placed in a position where she could potentially carry out the attack herself. But once again, she did not do it. She returned home, and Kelsey remained alive. At this point, the situation had reached a disturbing crossroads. Patrick had allegedly asked Crystal to help kill Kelsey more than once. Crystal had refused, yet she remained in contact with him. And according to her later testimony, she continued to believe the story he was telling her about Kelsey. This would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. During Patrick's trial, the defense challenged Crystal's credibility. Why had she not gone to the police? Why had she continued communicating with Patrick? Why had she traveled to Colorado? Why had she not warned Kelsey? Those questions followed Crystal throughout the trial, and they remain an important part of understanding her role. Because while Crystal ultimately became the prosecution's key witness, she was not an innocent bystander. She knew of the alleged plans. She had opportunities to intervene, and she ultimately pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence after helping Patrick clean up evidence connected to Kelsey's death. Her testimony was crucial, but it was also complicated. By October 2018, according to the prosecution's evidence, Patrick was allegedly still trying to convince Crystal to help him. This time, the plan involved a baseball bat. According to Crystal, Patrick asked whether she had access to one. He allegedly told her to use it against Kelsey. Crystal later testified that she refused. She said she could not do it. According to her account, Patrick responded by appealing to her emotions. He allegedly told her that this was not about him or Crystal. It was about his daughter. According to prosecutors, this was part of the manipulation Patrick used to persuade Crystal. He allegedly presented the killing as something necessary to protect a child. But there was no evidence that Kelsey was abusing her daughter. The child was not the reason Kelsey needed to disappear. She was the reason Patrick and Kelsey would always remain connected. And that distinction is important, because if Patrick wanted to end his relationship with Kelsey, there were legal and ordinary ways to do it. He could have ended the engagement. He could have sought custody through the courts. He could have separated from her. But according to the prosecution, he chose a different path, and each failed attempt brought him closer to the final one. By now, Crystal was no longer simply Patrick's former girlfriend. She had become part of a secret world that revolved around Kelsey's disappearance. She knew Patrick wanted Kelsey dead. She knew he had allegedly discussed multiple ways to accomplish it, and yet she remained emotionally connected to him. This is where the psychology of the case becomes particularly difficult to understand. Crystal later described Patrick as someone who manipulated her. She said he used her feelings for him. He allegedly made her feel responsible for protecting his daughter, and he portrayed himself as someone trapped in a terrible situation. But at the same time, Crystal was an adult capable of making decisions. She had choices, and each time she failed to report Patrick, the danger continued. In October 2018, according to investigators, Crystal reportedly told people close to her about Patrick's request for help. One friend allegedly urged her to contact the police. Another person reportedly knew that Patrick had been asking Crystal to help kill Kelsey, but no immediate intervention followed. That meant Kelsey remained unaware. She continued living her life. She continued raising her daughter. She continued going to work. And she continued interacting with Patrick. All the while, according to prosecutors, there was a secret network of conversations and plans taking place behind her back. One of the most remarkable aspects of the case was the distance involved. Crystal lived in Idaho. Patrick was in Colorado. The two were separated by hundreds of miles. But that distance did not prevent the alleged plans from developing. Instead, technology helped keep the relationship alive. Phone calls, text messages, online communication. The physical distance between them did not stop Patrick from influencing Crystal. And according to investigators, Crystal made repeated trips to Colorado. Each journey brought her closer to Kelsey, the woman she had been told was dangerous, the woman Patrick allegedly claimed was hurting their child, the woman who, from Crystal's perspective, stood between her and the man she still loved. But Kelsey didn't know any of this. She had no idea that Crystal existed in the way she did. No idea that Patrick's past relationship had returned. No idea that the woman Patrick was secretly communicating with had already been brought into discussions about her death. That secrecy was crucial because it meant Kelsey had no opportunity to protect herself. She couldn't confront Patrick about Crystal. She couldn't tell her family what was happening. She couldn't recognize the warning signs. She didn't know there were warning signs. According to Crystal's testimony, there were several moments when the situation could have ended differently. Crystal could have told Kelsey's family. She could have contacted law enforcement. She could have told Patrick's family. She could have confronted Kelsey. She could have walked away completely. But none of those things happened. Instead, the relationship between Patrick and Crystal continued. And according to the prosecution, Patrick eventually decided that if Crystal would not kill Kelsey, he would do it himself. By November 2018, the alleged plans had evolved from conversations into something much more concrete. The Thanksgiving holiday was approaching. Kelsey was making plans. She was thinking about food. She was caring for her daughter. And Patrick was allegedly preparing for the final act. The prosecution would later argue that he had created a situation in which Kelsey would feel comfortable enough to let him into her home. There was no reason for Kelsey to think she was meeting a stranger. This was the father of her child, her fiancé, someone she had known intimately. And that familiarity, according to the prosecution, gave Patrick an advantage. The exact details of what happened inside Kelsey's home on Thanksgiving Day became one of the most fiercely contested aspects of the case. But according to the prosecution and Crystal's testimony, Patrick had developed a plan that relied on trust. Kelsey was allegedly distracted with a seemingly innocent activity involving scented candles, according to the arrest affidavit. She was blindfolded and asked to identify different scents. The prosecution argued that this was a deliberate attempt to lower her guard. And then, according to the prosecution's evidence, Patrick attacked her. Kelsey was killed inside her own home. Her daughter was nearby. The child survived. Kelsey did not. The details of the crime were horrifying, but the most chilling aspect was the alleged preparation behind it. According to prosecutors, Patrick had not simply lost control in a moment of anger. He had allegedly spent weeks considering how to kill Kelsey. He had allegedly tried to recruit another person. He had allegedly discussed multiple methods. And when those plans failed, prosecutors argued, he eventually carried out the murder himself. Kelsey's death was therefore presented to the jury not as an isolated event, but as the culmination of a pattern of deception, manipulation, planning, and escalating desperation. After Kelsey was killed, according to Crystal's testimony, Patrick contacted her. The woman he had allegedly spent months trying to recruit had finally become the person he needed again. But this time, he wasn't asking her to kill Kelsey. He was asking her to help hide what had happened. According to Crystal, Patrick told her he had a mess to clean up. She began driving from Idaho toward Colorado. At first, she said she didn't fully understand what Patrick meant. Then, during another conversation, she realized the seriousness of what had happened. Kelsey was dead, and Patrick was asking Crystal to help him conceal the evidence. This was the moment when Crystal's role changed forever. She was no longer simply someone who knew about the plans. She was now being asked to participate in the aftermath, and according to her testimony, she agreed. She drove to Colorado. She went to Kelsey's home, and she helped Patrick clean up evidence. She also helped with efforts to make it appear that Kelsey had simply left. The details of the cleanup were later presented in court, but the broader significance was clear. Patrick allegedly understood that the disappearance would raise questions. He needed an explanation. He needed time. He needed Kelsey's family and co-workers to believe she might have chosen to leave. And according to prosecutors, Crystal became part of that deception. She was no longer on the outside. She was now connected to the crime. In the days after Kelsey's death, Patrick continued living his life. Kelsey's family was searching for her. Her mother was desperately trying to understand where her daughter had gone. Friends were asking questions. Investigators were beginning to examine the evidence. And Patrick was now in the middle of an investigation. But there was one person who knew what had happened, Crystal, and that created a new problem for Patrick. The woman he had spent years manipulating was now the person who could destroy everything. She knew about the plans. She knew about the relationship. She knew about the cleanup. She knew what Patrick had allegedly told her, and she knew what had happened to Kelsey. The longer she remained silent, the greater the risk that the truth would never come out. But the longer she remained connected to Patrick, the greater the danger became. The relationship that had once seemed like a second chance at love had now become something completely different. Crystal was carrying a secret involving a missing woman, a murdered mother, and a child who would grow up without knowing her mother. Eventually, the secret became too heavy, and that was when investigators began closing in. As law enforcement examined Kelsey's disappearance, they began reconstructing her final movements. They looked at her phone, Patrick's phone, the movements of both devices. They examined surveillance footage. They examined Kelsey's home. And they began looking at the strange journey her phone appeared to have taken after she disappeared. The phone had traveled away from Colorado. It had been used after Kelsey's disappearance. And investigators eventually traced that activity back toward Idaho, toward Crystal, the woman Patrick had kept secret. The woman who knew more about Kelsey than investigators initially realized. When authorities eventually confronted Crystal, the story began to unravel. And according to investigators, Crystal ultimately revealed what she knew. She admitted her relationship with Patrick. She admitted that he had allegedly asked her to help kill Kelsey. And she admitted that she had helped him after Kelsey's death. But Crystal's confession raised an even bigger question. If Patrick had asked her to kill Kelsey multiple times, if she had refused, if she had known he wanted Kelsey dead, why didn't she stop him? That question would follow Crystal into the courtroom. The defense would use it to challenge her credibility, and the jury would have to decide whether Crystal was telling the truth or whether she was simply telling the story that gave her the best chance of avoiding a murder conviction herself. But there was something else. The physical evidence, the phone records, the forensic evidence, the statement of people who had spoken with Crystal before Kelsey's disappearance. An increasingly detailed timeline investigators were building. Piece by piece, the story was coming together, and the closer investigators looked, the harder it became to believe that Kelsey had simply walked away. She had not abandoned her daughter. She had not disappeared voluntarily. She had not simply decided to start a new life. According to the evidence eventually presented at trial, Kelsey had been killed, and the man at the center of the investigation was the same man who had been standing between her and the rest of the world when she was last seen alive. Patrick Frazee, the fiancé, the father of her child, and, according to the jury that convicted him, the man responsible for her murder. But investigators still faced one enormous problem. They had a murder case. They had evidence. They had a witness. They had a confession from Crystal about her own role in the aftermath. But they did not have the one thing murder investigations almost always depend on. They did not have Kelsey's body. And now, the question was no longer simply what happened to Kelsey. The question was, Could investigators prove that Patrick had killed her without ever finding her? That would become the next battle, one that would take the case from the quiet streets of Woodland Park into a courtroom where Kelsey's family would finally hear the story of what happened to their daughter. In the days before Kelsey Berreth disappeared, there was nothing about her life that suggested she was about to become the victim of a murder that would capture national attention. She was still a mother, still a daughter, still a flight instructor, still a woman trying to manage the complicated responsibilities of work, family, and a relationship that had become increasingly difficult. And perhaps most importantly, she was still making plans for the future. That is what makes the final days of Kelsey's life so haunting. There was no dramatic farewell, no final message to her family saying goodbye, no indication that she knew she was in danger. Instead, Kelsey's final days were filled with the ordinary details of life, the kind of details that seem insignificant when they happen, but become unforgettable after someone is gone. By November 2018, Kelsey was living in Woodland Park, Colorado, with her young daughter. Her daughter was just 1 year old. She was at an age where every day brought something new. New words, new movements, new routines. And Kelsey was the person at the center of that little girl's world. For Kelsey, motherhood wasn't something happening in the background of her life. It was part of everything she did. She had a demanding career as a flight instructor, but she was also raising a young child. Her life required planning. She had to think about childcare. She had to think about work. She had to coordinate parenting responsibilities with Patrick, and she had to maintain her relationship with her family. To the people who knew her, Kelsey was not someone who could simply disappear without leaving behind a trail of concern. She had people who depended on her, people who expected to hear from her, people who knew her routines. And most importantly, she had a little girl who needed her. That was why her eventual disappearance was so difficult for her family to understand. But before anyone realized she was missing, Kelsey was simply living her life. And then came Thanksgiving. November 22nd, 2018, began like an ordinary holiday. For many families, Thanksgiving is a day of traditions, food, family, travel, phone calls, and the expectation that, for at least one day, everyone will come together. For Kelsey, the morning began with communication with her family. She spoke with her mother, Cheryl. From Cheryl's perspective, nothing was alarming about the conversation. Kelsey sounded happy. She sounded like herself. There was no indication that she believed she was in danger. No indication that she was preparing to disappear. No indication that she knew the person she was engaged to would eventually be accused of killing her. To her mother, it was simply another conversation between a mother and daughter. But in hindsight, that conversation became one of the last known moments when Kelsey's family could hear her voice. And then Kelsey went about her day. She took her young daughter with her to a Safeway grocery store in Woodland Park. Surveillance cameras captured her there. The footage showed a young mother going about an ordinary task. Kelsey was pushing a shopping cart. Her daughter was with her. She was buying groceries. There was nothing about the scene that immediately suggested danger. No visible panic. No obvious confrontation. No indication that something terrible was about to happen. If someone had watched that footage without knowing what came next, they would probably have seen nothing more than a mother completing her Thanksgiving shopping. But investigators would eventually study those images carefully, because they represented some of the last confirmed moments of Kelsey's life. The woman walking through that grocery store did not know that she was being seen for the final time. She did not know that her movements would later become evidence. She did not know that investigators would eventually reconstruct her final hours from surveillance footage, phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence. She was simply living. And that is what makes the footage so painful, because Kelsey was not acting like someone who intended to disappear. She was acting like someone who expected to be alive the next day, the next week, the next year. She was making ordinary plans. She was thinking about Thanksgiving. She was thinking about her daughter. She was thinking about food. She was thinking about the small, everyday details that make up a life. And then there was a message. Kelsey sent Patrick a text about sweet potatoes. The message was simple. She had bought sweet potatoes in case he wanted sweet potato casserole. On its own, it was nothing remarkable, but after Kelsey's disappearance, investigators and the public would look at that message differently, because it suggested that Kelsey was still thinking in terms of ordinary family life. She was still considering Patrick's preferences, still thinking about Thanksgiving, still making decisions that suggested there was a future ahead. There was no indication in that message that Kelsey knew she was about to die. And that is the contrast that makes this case so disturbing. While Kelsey was thinking about dinner, Patrick was allegedly thinking about murder. While Kelsey was caring for their daughter, Patrick was allegedly preparing for a confrontation that would end her life. While Kelsey was communicating with the man she was engaged to, she did not know that he had allegedly been discussing her death with another woman. The two realities existed at the same time. Kelsey was living in one. Patrick and Crystal were operating in another, and Kelsey had no idea. At some point on Thanksgiving Day, Kelsey dropped her daughter off with Patrick. That moment would become critical to the timeline. Kelsey was entrusting her child to the child's father. There was nothing unusual about that. Patrick was her fiancé. He was the father of their daughter. Whatever problems existed between them, there was still a level of trust that came with their relationship and their shared responsibilities as parents. Kelsey had no reason to believe that handing over their daughter would be the beginning of the end. But according to the prosecution's case, it was around this time that the final sequence of events began. The couple's daughter was now with Patrick. Kelsey returned to her home, and eventually, Patrick was seen at or near Kelsey's townhouse. Investigators later examined surveillance footage from the area. The footage became an important part of the prosecution's timeline. According to evidence presented at trial, surveillance from a neighboring property helped investigators establish Patrick's movements around Kelsey's home. The prosecution argued that Patrick made repeated trips to and from the townhouse that day. The significance of those movements only became clear later. At the time, Kelsey's family had no idea what was happening. They were not standing outside the home. They were not watching Patrick. They did not know that the man who was supposed to be part of Kelsey's future was allegedly about to become responsible for destroying it. Inside the townhouse, Kelsey was still living in the ordinary world. Outside, a different story was unfolding. The prosecution's case suggested that Patrick used familiarity and trust to get close to Kelsey. He did not need to force his way into her home. He was not a stranger. He was a father of her child. He was her fiancé, and that relationship mattered, because trust can be one of the most powerful forms of vulnerability. Kelsey knew Patrick. She had spent years with him. They had a child together. She had shared intimate parts of her life with him. So when he came to her home, there was no obvious reason for her to believe she needed to protect herself from him. According to testimony later given by Kenney, Patrick told her that he had created a situation in which Kelsey was distracted by scented candles and was blindfolded as part of a game involving identifying different scents. This account came from Crystal, the prosecution's key witness, and formed part of the state's reconstruction of the murder. The defense challenged Crystal's credibility and emphasized that she had received a plea deal in exchange for her testimony. But the jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's case and convicted Patrick. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, what began as an apparently harmless interaction suddenly turned into violence. Kelsey was attacked inside her own home, and somewhere nearby was the daughter she had spent the previous months caring for, a little girl too young to understand what was happening, too young to know that the woman she depended on was being taken away from her. And perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case is that Kelsey had no reason to believe that the man standing in front of her was about to become her killer. She had trusted him. She had built a family with him. And according to prosecutors, that trust was used against her. What happened next was reconstructed largely through the testimony of Kenney and the evidence investigators gathered afterward. According to Crystal, Patrick had previously discussed killing Kelsey with her. He had allegedly asked her to carry out the murder herself. She had refused. But prosecutors argued that Patrick eventually decided to do it himself. On Thanksgiving Day, inside Kelsey's Woodland Park home, Patrick attacked her with a baseball bat. The attack was fatal. Kelsey Berreth was dead. She was 29 years old, a daughter, a mother, a professional, and a woman who, only hours earlier, had been going about her ordinary life. The prosecution's case was that this was not an impulsive act. It was a culmination of weeks of planning. The state argued that Patrick had considered different ways of killing Kelsey. He had allegedly tried to recruit Crystal. He had allegedly developed multiple plans. And when those plans failed, he carried out the murder himself. That distinction became critical during the trial. The prosecution wasn't asking the jury to believe that Patrick simply lost his temper. They were presenting a picture of deliberate planning. A man who, according to their case, had already made the decision that Kelsey had to die. And once the attack was over, the next phase began, the cover-up. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick contacted her after Kelsey's death. The message was chilling in its simplicity. He needed help. There was a mess to clean up. Crystal drove from Idaho to Colorado. By then, she knew what had happened. She knew Kelsey was dead. And according to her testimony, she went to Kelsey's townhouse and helped Patrick clean the scene. Investigators would later find evidence that supported parts of Crystal's account. The scene had been extensively cleaned. The prosecution argued that this was evidence of an organized attempt to conceal the murder. Crystal later showed investigators where she said she had cleaned areas of Kelsey's home. She also provided information about what Patrick allegedly did with Kelsey's remains. According to Crystal, Patrick transported Kelsey's body to his property in Florissant. The prosecution argued that he later destroyed the remains, making it extremely difficult for investigators to recover them. Kelsey's body was never found. That fact became one of the central challenges of the prosecution's case. There was nobody there. There was no murder weapon recovered. And yet prosecutors argued that the evidence surrounding Kelsey's disappearance was overwhelming. They had a timeline. They had surveillance footage. They had phone records. They had forensic evidence from the townhouse. They had Crystal's testimony. And they had evidence suggesting Patrick had been trying to create the appearance that Kelsey had voluntarily left. The prosecution argued that the cover-up itself was evidence of consciousness of guilt, because if Kelsey had simply disappeared voluntarily, there would have been no reason to clean her home, no reason to move her phone, no reason to create false messages, no reason to conceal evidence. But there was something else that made the crime especially heartbreaking. Kelsey's daughter. She was only 1 year old, and on the day her mother died, she was reportedly nearby. The little girl could not understand the significance of what was happening. She could not know that she would never again grow up with her mother. She could not understand that the woman who had taken her grocery shopping that morning would not be there to watch her take her first steps, attend her first day of school, or hear the stories she would eventually tell about her childhood. She was too young to understand that a normal Thanksgiving had become the final day of her mother's life, and Kelsey's family would later be left with the responsibility of explaining a tragedy that no child should ever have to understand. The murder, therefore, did not end with Kelsey's death. It continued through the lives of the people she left behind. Her parents had lost their daughter. Her friends had lost someone they loved. And her daughter had lost her mother. The family that Kelsey had spent her final years building had been permanently shattered, and the man at the center of that family was now accused of destroying it. After Kelsey's death, Patrick allegedly began creating a false story. The goal, prosecutors argued, was to make it appear as though Kelsey had simply left. Her phone was moved, messages were sent, her employer was contacted, and communication was made to appear as though it had come from Kelsey. But there was one major problem. The story did not make sense. Kelsey had not packed up her belongings. She had not taken her car. Her personal items remained behind, and she had left her young daughter. To the people who knew Kelsey, that was almost impossible to believe. Her mother knew it. Her friends knew it. Her co-workers knew it. And eventually, investigators knew it too. The more they looked, the more the disappearance appeared staged. Kelsey had not simply walked away. Someone wanted people to believe she had. And then investigators discovered the phone trail. Kelsey's phone was eventually traced to Idaho, hundreds of miles from Colorado. The location pointed toward Crystal. And suddenly, the woman who had been hidden from Kelsey and from much of the outside world was now at the center of the investigation. Crystal had become the link between Patrick and the disappearance. And as investigators began questioning her, The carefully constructed story began to fall apart. When investigators confronted Crystal, she initially faced an impossible decision. She could remain silent. She could protect Patrick. Or she could tell the truth. Eventually, she began cooperating. And what she told investigators transformed the case. According to Crystal, Patrick had asked her multiple times to kill Kelsey. According to her account, he had discussed different methods. She had refused, but she had not gone to the police. And after Kelsey's death, she had helped him clean up. That made Crystal both a witness and a participant. Her testimony was powerful, but it was also deeply complicated. She had a motive to protect herself. She had received a plea agreement, and the defense repeatedly attacked her credibility. But despite those challenges, the prosecution's case continued to build. Other evidence supported important parts of her story, and the jury ultimately accepted the state's argument. Patrick Frazee was convicted of first-degree murder and other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 156 years. Kelsey Berreth's body, however, was never recovered, and that means there is still an element of the case that remains painfully unresolved. Her family never received the chance to bring her home. There was no funeral in which they could say goodbye to her remains, no final resting place to visit, no physical place where her daughter could someday stand and say, "This is where my mother rests." Instead, Kelsey remains missing in the most literal sense. But the truth about what happened to her was eventually established in court. When you look back at Kelsey's final day, the most disturbing thing is not simply how it ended. It is how ordinary it began. A mother went grocery shopping with her baby. She spoke to her own mother. She bought food for Thanksgiving. She sent a message about sweet potatoes. She went about her day. She was living as though she had a future. And that is the tragedy at the heart of Kelsey Berreth's story. She did have a future. She simply never got the chance to live it. The future where her daughter grew up. The future where she continued flying. The future where she watched her child become a teenager. The future where she celebrated birthdays and holidays. The future where she grew older. All of those possibilities ended on Thanksgiving Day in 2018. But the case also revealed something else. The most dangerous moments in a person's life do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they hide behind ordinary conversations, behind familiar faces, behind relationships that appear safe. And sometimes the person who poses the greatest danger is not a stranger in the darkness. It is someone who already has the key to your home, someone you trust, someone you love, someone you believe would never hurt you. For Kelsey, that person was the father of her child. And according to the jury that convicted him, the man she was supposed to marry. Her final day began with a mother caring for her child. It ended with a family losing a daughter, a mother, and a future. And for the people who loved Kelsey, Thanksgiving would never again be just a holiday. It would always be the day they lost her, the day an ordinary life came to an unimaginable end. This section is where the story should shift from the private tragedy of Kelsey's death to the public mystery of her disappearance. The emotional contrast is powerful. While Kelsey's family was desperately trying to find her, investigators were slowly uncovering evidence that someone had been working to make sure she would never be found. The hardest part for Kelsey's family was that, at first, they didn't know she was dead. They only knew she was missing. And that difference matters. Because when someone dies, there is a terrible finality to it. But when someone disappears, there is uncertainty. There is hope. There is fear. There are endless questions. Every unanswered phone call becomes a possibility. Every passing car becomes something to notice. Every unfamiliar person becomes someone who might know something. And for Kelsey's mother, Cheryl, that uncertainty began almost immediately. She knew her daughter. She knew her routines. She knew how devoted Kelsey was to her little girl. And she knew something was wrong. What Cheryl did not know was that, according to prosecutors, Kelsey's disappearance had already been carefully manipulated to look like something it wasn't. The woman her family was searching for was already dead, and the man who was allegedly responsible was attempting to create the impression that she had simply walked away. That deception would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because while Kelsey's family was trying to figure out where she had gone, Evidence suggested that someone was working just as hard to make sure they looked in the wrong direction. According to the prosecution's case, the events following Kelsey's murder were not random. They were part of a deliberate attempt to erase evidence. After Kelsey was killed, Patrick allegedly contacted Crystal Kenney. Crystal had previously been asked to participate in the murder, according to her testimony. She had refused. But now, according to her account, Patrick needed her for something else. He needed help cleaning up. Crystal later testified that Patrick told her he had a mess that needed to be dealt with. She drove from Idaho to Colorado. By the time she arrived, the focus was no longer on whether Kelsey would be killed. That had already happened. Now the question was whether Patrick could prevent anyone from discovering what he had done. According to Crystal's testimony, she went to Kelsey's townhouse. There, she helped Patrick clean the home. The cleanup was extensive. Investigators later found evidence that suggested the scene had been deliberately altered. The prosecution argued that Patrick and Crystal were attempting to remove traces of the crime and create the appearance that nothing unusual had happened inside the home. This was not simply a matter of wiping down a surface. The evidence presented at trial suggested a broader effort to eliminate signs that Kelsey had been killed there. And this is where the case took another disturbing turn. Because Kelsey's home was supposed to be the place where she felt safest. It was where she lived with her daughter. It was where she kept her belongings. It was where she had spent ordinary days living an ordinary life. But after her death, according to prosecutors, the same home became a crime scene that someone was desperately trying to erase. One of the most important pieces of forensic evidence came from the floor of Kelsey's townhouse. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting that the carpet had been cleaned. But cleaning a surface does not necessarily erase what happened there. Sometimes, attempts to clean a crime scene can actually create new evidence. Investigators later used forensic techniques to examine areas of the home. What they found helped prosecutors argue that an attempt had been made to remove evidence of the murder. The cleaning itself became suspicious. Why had certain areas been treated differently? Why had someone gone to such lengths to remove traces from the home? And, perhaps most importantly, why would anyone need to clean Kelsey's house if she had simply left voluntarily? The prosecution argued that the answer was obvious. Someone had been trying to hide what happened. And the more investigators examined the evidence, the more difficult it became to believe that Kelsey had simply decided to leave her life behind. Her daughter was still there. Her belongings were still there. Her vehicle was still there. Her life was still there. Only Kelsey was missing. That was the contradiction investigators could not ignore. But cleaning the home was only one part of the alleged cover-up. According to the prosecution, Patrick also took steps to destroy or conceal other evidence. The most important evidence was Kelsey's body. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick transported Kelsey's remains away from the townhouse. He allegedly took them to his family's ranch property in Florissant. What happened afterward became one of the most difficult aspects of the case. According to Crystal, Patrick eventually destroyed Kelsey's remains. The prosecution argued that the destruction was intended to make the body impossible to recover and prevent investigators from establishing the exact circumstances of her death through an autopsy. Kelsey's body was never found. That meant her family would never have the opportunity to bury her. There would be no funeral centered around her remains. No grave. No final physical place where her loved ones could go to remember her. The absence of Kelsey's body became a permanent wound for her family. But legally, it also created a challenge. How do you prove a murder when the victim's body is missing? The answer, prosecutors argued, was through the evidence surrounding the disappearance. The prosecution did not need to prove every detail of what happened to Kelsey. They needed to prove that she had been killed and that Patrick was responsible. And they argued that the evidence told a clear story. Kelsey had vanished. Her personal life had been left behind. Patrick's movements raised questions. His statements contained inconsistencies. And the evidence pointed toward an elaborate attempt to conceal what had happened. The absence of a body did not mean the absence of a crime. In fact, prosecutors argued that the very effort to destroy Kelsey's remains was itself evidence of a deliberate attempt to conceal murder. One of the most important pieces of the cover-up involved Kelsey's phone. Because a phone can tell a story. It can reveal where someone was, who they communicated with, what they searched for, and sometimes, even after someone is gone, their phone can continue to tell investigators where they went. According to the prosecution, Kelsey's phone was used after her disappearance. Messages were sent, activity occurred, and the device eventually traveled far away from Colorado. The prosecution argued that these actions were part of an attempt to make Kelsey's disappearance appear voluntary. If investigators believed Kelsey had left on her own, they might assume she was somewhere else, perhaps traveling, perhaps starting over, perhaps avoiding contact with her family. But there was one problem. Kelsey had a daughter, and Kelsey was not the kind of person who would simply disappear without making arrangements for a child. Her family knew that. Her friends knew that. And eventually, investigators began to recognize it too. The phone activity might have suggested that Kelsey was still alive, but the rest of the evidence told a different story. And slowly, investigators began to realize that the phone itself might have been part of the deception. According to the prosecution, there was also an attempt to make it appear as though Kelsey was communicating with people after her disappearance. Messages were reportedly sent to create the impression that she had left voluntarily. The idea was simple. If Kelsey appeared to be communicating, perhaps people would believe she was alive. If people believed she was alive, the urgency of the search might decrease. If the search slowed down, there would be more time to conceal the truth. But the plan had a fundamental weakness. The people receiving those messages knew Kelsey. They knew how she communicated. They knew her habits. And they knew that something about the messages didn't feel right. Her mother, Cheryl, was particularly concerned. The communication did not match what she expected from her daughter. Kelsey had disappeared without explanation, and now some messages seemed to suggest she was choosing to stay away. But why? Why would she leave her daughter? Why would she leave her belongings? Why would she leave her car? Why would she disappear from a life she had spent years building? The questions multiplied. And the more Kelsey's family looked at the situation, the less the idea of a voluntary disappearance made sense. For Kelsey's family, the first days after her disappearance were filled with uncertainty. Her mother did not know what had happened. She did not know whether Kelsey was safe. She did not know whether she had been kidnapped. She did not know whether she had left voluntarily. She did not know whether someone was holding her somewhere. And most terrifying of all, she did not know whether her daughter was still alive. Every possibility was frightening. But uncertainty can sometimes be even more painful than the truth, because as long as there is no answer, there is always a possibility. Maybe Kelsey will walk through the door. Maybe her phone will ring. Maybe she will suddenly appear. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation. That hope can keep a family going, but it can also keep them trapped in a nightmare. Kelsey's mother reported her missing on December 2nd, 2018. That was 10 days after Thanksgiving. 10 days. For 10 days, Kelsey's family had been trying to understand where she was. And for 10 days, according to prosecutors, the person responsible for her disappearance had been attempting to maintain the illusion that she had left voluntarily. When Cheryl finally reported Kelsey missing, the case officially entered a new phase. It was no longer simply a family emergency. It was now a law enforcement investigation, and investigators immediately began asking questions. Where was Kelsey? When was she last seen? Who had spoken with her? Who had access to her? Who had a reason to want her gone? And perhaps the most important question, who was the last person known to have been with her? The answer was Patrick. Patrick was not a stranger. He was Kelsey's fiancé. He was the father of her child. And he was among the last people known to have had contact with her. That placed him in a difficult position. He was also the person who should have been most concerned about finding Kelsey. After all, if Kelsey had disappeared, Patrick had lost his fiancée. Their daughter had lost her mother. A normal reaction would have been panic, fear, desperation, a determination to find her. But investigators began examining Patrick's behavior. And according to prosecution, some of his actions raised suspicions. The case against him would eventually focus on inconsistencies in his account, his movements, and the evidence investigators uncovered. But in the early days, authorities did not immediately have the full picture. They were trying to determine whether Kelsey had disappeared voluntarily. They were trying to understand her relationship with Patrick. And they were trying to determine whether there was any reason for her to leave. The family provided information about Kelsey's personality, her habits, her relationships, her responsibilities, and her devotion to her daughter. The picture that emerged was not of a woman planning to disappear. It was of a woman who had a career, a child, a family, a home, and a life. The theory that Kelsey had simply walked away began to look increasingly unlikely. As investigators continued their work, surveillance footage became increasingly important. Cameras had captured Kelsey's movements before she disappeared. They had also captured Patrick's movements. The footage helped investigators reconstruct a timeline. Kelsey had been seen going about her normal routine. She had gone shopping. She had spent time with her daughter. And then she had disappeared. Patrick's movements, however, became increasingly significant. Investigators examined footage from around Kelsey's townhouse. They looked at the times Patrick arrived. They looked at the times he left. They looked at what he appeared to be carrying. And they began comparing those movements with the statements he had given. The goal was to determine whether Patrick's version of events matched what the cameras showed. According to prosecution, it did not. The surveillance evidence would later become one of the pieces used to challenge Patrick's account. Because cameras don't care about relationships. They don't care about explanations. They simply record movement. And in this case, those movements help investigators begin reconstructing what happened during the period when Kelsey disappeared. Then came another major development. Kelsey's phone. Investigators tracked its movements. And those movements eventually led them toward Idaho, toward Crystal Kenney. At first glance, Crystal might not have appeared to have any connection to Kelsey. She was hundreds of miles away. She was married. She had her own life. But investigators discovered something that changed the direction of the case. Crystal had a history with Patrick. And that history was not simply a casual friendship. The two had been romantically involved for years. They had maintained a complicated relationship that had continued even after Patrick became involved with Kelsey. Now investigators had a possible motive, a hidden relationship, a secret, and a person who appeared to know more than she had initially revealed. Crystal became a critical figure, and when investigators began questioning her, the wall of secrecy surrounding Kelsey's disappearance began to crack. Crystal eventually began cooperating with investigators, and what she told them was shocking. According to her account, Patrick had previously asked her to kill Kelsey, not once, but multiple times. She described alleged plans. She described Patrick's claims about Kelsey. She described the relationship between herself and Patrick. And she described what happened after Kelsey's death. For investigators, this was a breakthrough, because until that point, they had been trying to solve a disappearance. Now, they were hearing about an alleged murder, and the story Crystal told them provided a possible explanation for evidence they had already uncovered. The cleaning, the phone, the suspicious movements, the attempts to make Kelsey appear to have left. The more investigators examined Crystal's account, the more they were able to compare it against independent evidence. And that became critical, because Crystal had her own reasons to tell a particular story. She was involved. She had helped Patrick after murder. According to her own admission, she eventually pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence. So investigators couldn't simply accept everything she said without question. They had to verify it. And they began looking for evidence that existed outside Crystal's story. The investigation eventually revealed a disturbing pattern. Kelsey had disappeared. Patrick had been among the last people known to see her. Her phone had been moved. Messages had been sent that appeared to create the impression she was alive. Her home had been cleaned. Evidence had allegedly been destroyed. And the woman who had been Patrick's secret lover was now telling investigators that he had confessed to killing Kelsey. The pieces began fitting together. But one critical question remained. Where was Kelsey? Her family needed an answer. They needed to know what had happened to her. They needed to bring her home. But investigators were facing a devastating reality. The evidence suggested Kelsey was dead, and yet they could not find her body. Searches were conducted. Investigators examined Patrick's property. They looked at areas connected to the case. But Kelsey remained missing. The woman her family had spent days hoping to find was gone. and the person prosecutors believe was responsible had allegedly gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure she stayed gone. For Kelsey's family, the investigation was about more than building a criminal case. They wanted Kelsey back. Even if the worst had happened, they wanted the chance to say goodbye. They wanted to know where she was. They wanted to know what had happened to their daughter. They wanted to be able to tell her little girl where her mother was. But the investigation could not give them that. Kelsey's body was never recovered. That meant the family was forced to live with an unbearable kind of uncertainty. They knew she was gone. They knew she had been murdered. They knew who had been convicted. But they never had the physical remains that would allow them to close that final chapter. For many families, closure is an overused word. There is no simple moment when grief disappears. But having a place to bury someone can provide a sense of finality. Kelsey's family was denied even that. In the end, the cover-up did not succeed. The phone records did not disappear. The surveillance footage remained. The forensic evidence remained. The messages remained. Crystal remained. And investigators continued asking questions. The very actions allegedly intended to conceal Kelsey's murder ultimately became evidence against Patrick. The cleanup became suspicious. The destruction of evidence became suspicious. The attempts to create a false narrative became suspicious. And the more Patrick allegedly tried to make Kelsey disappear, the more investigators began to understand that her disappearance itself was evidence. The woman who had supposedly chosen to leave had left behind too much. Her daughter, her belongings, her vehicle, her career, her family, her life, and all those things pointed to one conclusion. Kelsey had not walked away. Someone had taken her away. Eventually, investigators concluded that Kelsey's family had feared from the beginning. Kelsey was dead. The investigation had transformed from a missing person case into a murder investigation, and Patrick became the central suspect. Crystal's testimony became a major part of the prosecution's case. Her account helped investigators understand what had happened behind the scenes. But the case did not rest entirely on her words. The prosecution presented evidence that they argued corroborated her story. The jury ultimately found Patrick guilty of Kelsey's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. Crystal pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence and received a sentence of 24 years in prison. But there was still one thing missing. Kelsey. Her family had answers about what happened, but they never got her back. The search for Kelsey began with hope. Her mother believed she was still alive. Her family believed there had to be an explanation. They wanted to believe that Kelsey would come home. But as the investigation progressed, hope slowly gave way to a terrible certainty. Kelsey was not coming home. And the people who had been searching for her were now searching for the truth. What happened inside her townhouse? Why had her home been cleaned? Why had her phone traveled to Idaho? Why had someone tried to make her appear as though she had left voluntarily? Why had Patrick been communicating with Crystal? And where was Kelsey's body? Those questions drove the investigation. And they also became the questions that Kelsey's family would have to live with. The case eventually answered many of them. But not all. The most painful question remained unanswered. Where is Kelsey? Kelsey's mother began to search for her daughter because something inside her told her that Kelsey would never simply abandon her child. That instinct was correct. Kelsey had not left voluntarily. She had not chosen to disappear. She had not chosen to abandon her daughter. According to the evidence presented at trial, her life had been taken from her, and then an attempt had been made to erase the evidence. But Kelsey could not be erased. Her family kept searching. Investigators kept digging. And eventually, the truth emerged. The cover-up that was supposed to hide Kelsey's fate instead became part of the evidence that revealed it. The cleaned home, the missing phone, the false messages, the destroyed evidence, the secret relationship, the witness who finally spoke. Piece by piece, the disappearance became a murder case. And the woman at the center of it all was finally given a voice. Not through her own words, because she had been silenced, but through the evidence left behind. Kelsey had been a daughter, a mother, a pilot, a friend, a woman with plans for her future. And on Thanksgiving Day 2018, she disappeared. For days, her family searched for her. For weeks, Investigators searched for answers. And for years, the question of what happened to Kelsey remained a haunting reminder of how quickly an ordinary life can be destroyed. Her body was never found. But the truth about her death eventually came to light. And perhaps that is the most important part of Kelsey's story. The people who loved her refused to let her disappearance become the end of her story. They kept asking questions. They kept searching. And ultimately, they helped ensure that Kelsey Berreth would not be remembered simply as a missing woman. She was a daughter, she was a mother, and she was a person whose life mattered, even when someone tried to make her disappear. For Kelsey Berreth's family, the investigation began with a question that had no easy answer. Where was Kelsey? At first, it was a missing person case. A young mother had disappeared. Her daughter was still alive. Her belongings were still at home. Her car was still there. And the people who loved Kelsey were desperate to believe that there was a logical explanation. Perhaps she had gone somewhere. Perhaps she needed time away. Perhaps she was safe and would eventually return. But as investigators began examining the evidence, the possibility that Kelsey had simply walked away became harder and harder to accept. The more they looked, the more they discovered that the disappearance appeared to have been carefully constructed. There were strange movements, unusual phone activity, evidence that Kelsey's home had been cleaned, and, eventually, a connection to a woman hundreds of miles away who appeared to know far more about Kelsey's disappearance than anyone initially realized. Her name was Kenney, and once investigators began pulling on that thread, the entire case began to unravel. What had initially appeared to be the disappearance of a young mother slowly transformed into something much darker, a murder, a secret relationship, a series of alleged plans, and an attempt to destroy the evidence. The breakthrough did not come from one single piece of evidence. It came from investigators putting seemingly separate pieces together until they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. When Kelsey's family reported her missing, investigators immediately began reconstructing her final known movements. They wanted to know where she had been, who she had spoken to, who had seen her, and, most importantly, who had last been with her. The investigation quickly focused on the period surrounding Thanksgiving Day in 2018. Kelsey had been living her ordinary life. She had gone shopping. She had communicated with her family. She had made plans involving Thanksgiving food. She had cared for her young daughter. Then she disappeared. But the evidence suggested that she had not simply vanished into thin air. Investigators began examining surveillance footage from the area around her townhouse. The footage helped establish a timeline of activity around Kelsey's home. It became increasingly important because investigators were trying to compare what the cameras showed with the stories people were telling them. And one person quickly became central to that timeline. Patrick Frazee, Kelsey's fiancé, the father of her daughter, and, ultimately, the man prosecutors would accuse of killing her. Patrick's relationship with Kelsey immediately made him an important figure in the investigation. But investigators had to be careful. A missing person's fiancé is not automatically responsible for her disappearance. They needed evidence. They needed to understand the relationship. They needed to know whether Kelsey had any reason to leave. And they needed to determine what Patrick had been doing around the time she disappeared. As investigators continued, they discovered inconsistencies. The story surrounding Kelsey's disappearance did not seem to fit the physical evidence. And then there was Kelsey's phone. One of the most important breakthroughs came from technology. Kelsey's phone did not simply disappear with her. Investigators were able to track its activity and movements after she was supposedly gone. The phone eventually became associated with activity in Idaho. That was significant because Kelsey lived in Colorado. Why would her phone suddenly be traveling hundreds of miles away? And who was carrying it? Investigators followed the trail. The answer eventually led them to Kenney. At first, Crystal might have seemed like an unlikely person to be connected to the case. She was not Kelsey's close friend. She was not a member of Kelsey's family. And she was not someone investigators initially knew to be part of Kelsey's life. But Crystal had a secret connection to Patrick, a connection that stretched back years. The two had previously been romantically involved, and according to the evidence later presented in court, their relationship had continued in secret even after Patrick became engaged to Kelsey. Suddenly, investigators had another possible explanation for the strange phone activity. But they also had a much bigger question. What did Crystal know? As investigators examined Patrick's relationship with Crystal, the case became increasingly complicated. Crystal was not simply a former girlfriend. According to her own testimony, she and Patrick had maintained an emotional connection over many years. Their relationship had repeatedly ended and restarted. And eventually, Patrick had become involved with Kelsey. He had a child with her. They were engaged. But according to the prosecution, Patrick continued communicating with Crystal. And at some point, Crystal learned the full truth. Patrick was not the single man she may have imagined him to be. He had a fiancée. He had a daughter. And his life with Kelsey was far more serious than Crystal had apparently understood. But instead of ending his relationship with Crystal, prosecutors argued that Patrick continued to manipulate the situation. Crystal eventually became aware of Kelsey, and according to her later testimony, Patrick began portraying Kelsey as a problem, a threat, someone he allegedly claimed was harming their daughter. The prosecution argued that Patrick used Crystal's emotional attachment to him to manipulate her. And then, according to Crystal, he began asking her to help kill Kelsey. That revelation changed everything, because investigators were no longer dealing with a simple missing person case. They were now investigating the possibility of a planned murder. Crystal became one of the most important people in the investigation, but she was also one of the most complicated. She was not simply a witness who happened to know something. According to her own account, she had been drawn into the events surrounding Kelsey's death. She had allegedly been asked to participate in plans to kill Kelsey. She had refused, but she had also failed to report Patrick to the police. And after Kelsey's death, she admitted helping him clean up evidence. That meant investigators had to approach her story carefully. They could not simply take everything she said at face value. They needed corroboration. They needed to know whether her account matched the physical evidence. They needed to know whether her timeline made sense. And they needed to understand what she had to gain by cooperating. Crystal eventually entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. She pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence. In exchange for her cooperation, she received a sentence of 24 years in prison. That agreement would become a major issue during Patrick's trial. The defense would argue that Crystal had a powerful incentive to blame Patrick, but the prosecution maintained that her testimony was supported by evidence that existed independently of her statements. And that distinction would become critical. Investigators returned to Kelsey's townhouse. They examined the scene. They examined the floors. They examined the walls. They examined areas that appeared to have been cleaned. The prosecution argued that the cleaning was part of an effort to remove evidence of the murder. But investigators were able to recover forensic evidence that helped establish that something violent had happened inside the home. The townhouse itself became a silent witness. Kelsey had disappeared, but the scene had not forgotten her. There were traces, patterns, evidence that someone had tried to erase what happened. And the harder investigators looked, the more they found. The prosecution eventually argued that the evidence inside the townhouse was consistent with Crystal's account of a cleanup. That was important, because if Crystal's story had been completely unsupported, the defense could argue that she had simply invented it. But investigators found evidence that helped corroborate parts of her account. The pieces were beginning to connect. Surveillance footage became another crucial piece of the puzzle. Investigators were able to examine Patrick's movements around the time Kelsey disappeared. The footage helped establish a timeline. It showed vehicles, movements, arrivals, departures, and according to prosecutors, it contradicted parts of Patrick's account of what had happened. The footage did not tell the entire story, but it provided something incredibly valuable to investigators, a record that could not be easily changed. People could lie, people could forget, people could change their stories, but cameras simply recorded what happened in front of them. Investigators could compare the footage with phone records. They could compare it with witness statements. They could compare it with Patrick's explanations. And as the different pieces were placed side by side, prosecutors argued that a pattern emerged. Patrick's movements were consistent with their theory of the crime, and they argued inconsistent with the idea that Kelsey had simply left. Investigators also examined what happened after Kelsey's disappearance. According to prosecutors, someone had attempted to make it appear as though Kelsey had voluntarily left. Her phone was moved. Messages were sent. Her disappearance was presented as something that might have been her own choice. But the story quickly began to fall apart. Kelsey had left behind too much. Her young daughter was still there. Her personal belongings remained. Her car remained. And there was no credible reason for her to suddenly abandon her entire life. Kelsey's family knew this. And eventually, investigators knew it too. The prosecution argued that the false communications were not random. They were part of an effort to delay the discovery of the murder. If Kelsey's family believed she had simply left, perhaps they would wait. Perhaps they would assume she was safe. Perhaps investigators would not immediately treat the disappearance as a homicide. But Kelsey's family did not accept that explanation. They kept searching, and the investigation continued. Eventually, Crystal began talking, and what she told investigators was devastating. According to her account, Patrick had confessed to killing Kelsey. She described the alleged murder. She described the cleanup. She described the destruction of evidence. And she told investigators where she believed Patrick had taken Kelsey's remains. The information gave investigators a roadmap. They could now compare her story against everything else they had discovered, and that is what made Crystal's testimony so important. It was not simply that she accused Patrick. It was that her account allegedly helped explain evidence investigators had already found. The phone, the movements, the cleaning, the missing body, the attempts to create the appearance of a voluntary disappearance. All of these separate pieces now appear to fit into a single narrative. According to prosecutors, Patrick had killed Kelsey. Then he tried to erase the evidence. Crystal had become involved in the aftermath, and the two had attempted to create a false story about Kelsey's disappearance. But there was still one enormous problem. Kelsey's body was missing. The absence of Kelsey's body became one of the most emotionally painful and legally significant aspects of the case. For Kelsey's family, it meant they could not bury her. They could not have the kind of funeral that so many families rely on to begin grieving. They could not stand beside a grave. They could not bring her daughter to a final resting place. Kelsey was simply gone. But from a legal standpoint, the prosecution faced an additional challenge. Without a body, the defense could argue that the state had not conclusively established what had happened to Kelsey. The prosecution had to prove that she was dead, and then they had to prove that Patrick was responsible. They could not rely on an autopsy. They could not point to a body. They had to build the case from everything else. And prosecutors argued that the evidence was overwhelming. Kelsey had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Her home showed signs of an attempted cleanup. Her phone had been moved. False communications had allegedly been created. Patrick had reportedly discussed killing her before her disappearance. Crystal had provided information about the murder and the cleanup, and Patrick had allegedly attempted to conceal the evidence. The prosecution argued that when all those pieces were considered together, there was only one reasonable conclusion. Kelsey had been murdered, and Patrick was responsible. In 2019, Patrick Frazee went on trial for the murder of Kelsey Berreth. The trial attracted national attention. At its center was a simple question. Did Patrick Frazee kill the mother of his child? The prosecution said yes. The defense said no. And without Kelsey's body, the jury had to carefully examine every piece of evidence. The trial would ultimately become a battle over credibility. Who was telling the truth? Patrick? Crystal? The investigators? The forensic evidence? The surveillance footage? The phone records? The prosecution had to convince 12 jurors that the evidence formed a coherent story. The defense, meanwhile, had an opportunity to attack the prosecution's case. And the defense focused heavily on Crystal. When Crystal entered the courtroom, she was not simply a witness. She was a person who had admitted involvement in the aftermath of Kelsey's death. She had pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence. She was already facing prison time, and she was now asking the jury to believe her story about Patrick. Her testimony was emotional. She described her long relationship with Patrick. She explained how she had remained emotionally attached to him. She described the way he allegedly portrayed Kelsey. And she told the jury that Patrick had asked her to kill Kelsey. Not once, but repeatedly. She described different alleged plans. She told the jury that Patrick had tried to convince her that Kelsey was dangerous, and she explained how she eventually became involved in the aftermath of the murder. According to Crystal, Patrick called her after Kelsey's death. She traveled to Colorado, and she helped him clean up. She also testified about what Patrick allegedly told her regarding Kelsey's remains. Her testimony gave the jury something they did not have from any other source: a direct account of what Patrick allegedly told her. But the defense did not allow her testimony to go unchallenged. The defense argued that Crystal had reasons to lie. She had admitted her own involvement. She had received a plea agreement, and she was facing a long prison sentence. The defense suggested that Crystal had an incentive to shift blame toward Patrick. If Patrick was convicted, she could avoid facing the full consequences of a murder charge. The defense also questioned why Crystal had not gone to police earlier. If she really believed Patrick was planning to kill Kelsey, why didn't she stop him? Why didn't she warn Kelsey? Why didn't she contact investigators? Why did she continue communicating with Patrick? And why did she help him after Kelsey's death? These questions were important because Crystal's story was complicated. She was not an innocent witness who had stumbled across information. She had been involved, and the jury had to decide whether that involvement made her testimony less credible or whether it made her account more believable, because she was admitting things that could also incriminate herself. The prosecution argued that Crystal had no reason to invent the details. Her own actions had already placed her in legal jeopardy, and investigators had found evidence that supported important parts of her account. The jury would ultimately have to decide. The prosecution's case did not rest on one piece of evidence. It was a combination. That was the central strategy. Imagine placing pieces of a puzzle on a table. One piece is Kelsey's disappearance. Another is the condition of her home. Another is the phone. Another is the surveillance footage. Another is Patrick's alleged statements. Another is Crystal. Another is the evidence of the cleanup. Another is the destruction of Kelsey's remains. Individually, each piece might be questioned, but prosecutors argued that when all the pieces were placed together, they formed a clear picture. Kelsey had been killed. Patrick had planned it. Crystal had been drawn into the plan. And after the murder, Patrick had tried to conceal what happened. The prosecution also argued that Patrick's behavior after Kelsey's disappearance demonstrated consciousness of guilt. He allegedly did not simply wait for Kelsey to return. He allegedly participated in creating the appearance that she had left. He allegedly cleaned the crime scene. He allegedly moved evidence. And he allegedly destroyed her remains. According to prosecutors, those were not the actions of an innocent man trying to find his missing fiancée. They were the actions of someone attempting to hide a murder. The defense maintained that the prosecution's case was not as straightforward as it appeared. The absence of Kelsey's body was a major issue. Without a body, the jury had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, and the defense challenged the reliability of Crystal's testimony. They pointed to her plea deal. They pointed to her involvement. They questioned her motives. They argued that she had every reason to cooperate with prosecutors. But the prosecution countered that murder convictions can be based on circumstantial evidence. The law does not require prosecutors to produce a body if they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim was murdered. And in this case, the state argued that the evidence was not merely circumstantial. They had Crystal's testimony. They had forensic evidence. They had surveillance. They had phone records. They had evidence of a cleanup. And they had evidence suggesting an attempt to fabricate a story about Kelsey's disappearance. The jury listened, and then they had to make a decision. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its conclusion. Patrick Frazee was found guilty of first-degree murder in Kelsey Berreth's death. He was also convicted of solicitation to commit murder. The jury had accepted the prosecution's argument that Kelsey's disappearance was not a mystery. It was a murder, and Patrick was responsible. The fact that Kelsey's body had never been found had not prevented the prosecution from proving its case. The evidence surrounding her disappearance was enough. The phone, the surveillance, the forensic evidence, the cleanup, the false narrative, Crystal's testimony, and the broader pattern of behavior. Together, they convinced the jury. Patrick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. Crystal Kenney, who had pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence and testified against Patrick, was sentenced to 24 years in prison. The trial was over, but Kelsey's family still faced an unbearable reality. They knew who had been convicted. They knew what the evidence said had happened, but they still did not have Kelsey. Even after Patrick's conviction, one question remained. Where is Kelsey? Searches had been conducted. Investigators had followed leads. They had searched areas connected to Patrick, but Kelsey's remains were never recovered. For her family, that meant the case could never feel completely finished. There was justice in the courtroom, but there was no final goodbye. Kelsey's daughter would grow up knowing her mother through photographs, memories, and the stories told by the people who loved her. But she would never have the chance to grow up with Kelsey. She would never hear her mother's voice as an adult, never ask her questions about childhood, never experience the ordinary relationship between a daughter and her mother as she grew older. That loss could never be repaired by a courtroom verdict. But the verdict did establish something important. Kelsey had not abandoned her child. She had not simply walked away. She had not chosen to disappear. The evidence had finally answered the question that had tormented her family since Thanksgiving 2018. Kelsey Berreth had been murdered, and Patrick Frazee was responsible. The breakthrough in Kelsey's case was not one dramatic discovery. It was a slow accumulation of evidence. Investigators followed the phone. The phone led them to Crystal. Crystal led them to Patrick. The forensic evidence supported parts of Crystal's story. The surveillance footage helped establish the timeline. The cleanup suggested an attempt to destroy evidence. The false communication suggested an attempt to create a false explanation. And the destruction of Kelsey's remains explained why the most important piece of evidence, the body itself, could not be found. In the end, the investigation revealed something deeply unsettling. Kelsey's disappearance had been designed to look like a disappearance. But the more investigators investigated, the more they realized that it was actually a cover-up. The person responsible had allegedly tried to erase the evidence. But the evidence was still there, in the phone records, in the surveillance cameras, in the forensic traces, in the messages, in the testimony of the people involved, and ultimately, in the story that the evidence told when everything was put together. Kelsey's family began their search, hoping to find a missing daughter. They eventually found the truth about a murdered one. And although they never found Kelsey's body, they found something else that mattered. They found answers. They found accountability. And they ensured that the woman who had disappeared on Thanksgiving Day would not disappear from history. Because Kelsey Berreth was more than name in a murder case. She was a daughter. She was a mother. She was a pilot. She was a friend. She was a woman who had an entire future ahead of her. And even though that future was taken from her, the evidence left behind ultimately told her story. A story that began with an ordinary Thanksgiving. A story that became a desperate search. A story that turned into a murder investigation. And a story that ended with a jury deciding that the man Kelsey had trusted with her life was the man responsible for taking it. But perhaps the most haunting question remains the one investigators could never answer. Where is Kelsey? Because even after the verdict, even after conviction, even after justice was served in a courtroom, Kelsey's family is still waiting for the one thing they have never been able to bring home. Kelsey herself. This final section should bring the story back to Kelsey herself rather than ending only with the convictions. The strongest emotional note is the contrast between the legal resolution and the family's unresolved loss. Justice was achieved in court, but Kelsey was never brought home. After months of investigation, interviews, forensic analysis, and courtroom testimony, the case against Patrick Frazee finally reached its conclusion. But for Kelsey's family, there was an important distinction between justice and closure. The justice came in the courtroom. The closure they wanted never fully arrived. Because even after the evidence had been presented, even after a jury had listened to the testimony, and even after a verdict had been delivered, one question remained unanswered. Where was Kelsey? In November 2019, nearly a year after Kelsey's disappearance, Patrick Frazee was sentenced for his role in her murder. The jury had already found him guilty of first-degree murder and solicitation to commit murder. The The verdict represented the culmination of an investigation that had begun with a family desperately searching for a missing woman. It had started with questions. Where was Kelsey? Why had she disappeared? Why had her phone been moved? Why had her home been cleaned? Why were there signs that someone had attempted to create the impression that she had voluntarily left? And, eventually, the most important question of all, who had killed her? The prosecution's answer was Patrick. The jury agreed. Patrick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Kelsey's murder, along with an additional 156 years for other convictions, including solicitation to commit murder. He would never walk free again. For Kelsey's family, the sentence meant that the person responsible for her death had been held accountable. But there was no celebration. There could not be. A prison sentence could not return Kelsey. It could not give her daughter back the mother she had lost. It could not erase the memories of Thanksgiving Day. And it could not answer the question that remained at the heart of the family's pain. Where was Kelsey's body? Patrick was not the only person whose life was permanently changed by the murder. Crystal Kenney had become a central figure in the investigation. She was a woman who had once been romantically involved with Patrick. The woman who, according to her own testimony, had been asked to participate in plans to kill Kelsey. And the woman who eventually became a key witness for the prosecution. Crystal's involvement in the case was complicated. She was not the person who ultimately stood trial for Kelsey's murder, but she was not an innocent bystander either. According to the prosecution and her own admissions, Crystal helped Patrick after Kelsey's death. She helped clean the crime scene. She participated in the destruction or concealment of evidence. And she knew that Kelsey was dead. Those actions made her part of the cover-up. Crystal eventually pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence. She received a 24-year prison sentence. Her cooperation with investigators and her testimony against Patrick became a major part of the prosecution's case. For the state, her testimony helped explain what happened behind closed doors. She provided investigators with information about Patrick's alleged plans. She described conversations between herself and Patrick. She explained what she said Patrick had told her about Kelsey's murder, and she described the events that followed. But Crystal's cooperation did not erase her own responsibility. She had made choices. She had become involved. And those choices had consequences. After serving part of her sentence, Crystal Kenney was eventually released from prison. Her release marked another chapter in a case that had already left so many lives permanently changed. But for Kelsey's family, Crystal's freedom could never change what had happened. Kelsey was still gone. Her daughter was still growing up without her mother, and the family still had no grave to visit, no place to lay flowers, no physical location where they could stand and say goodbye. Crystal could eventually return to society. Kelsey could not. That contrast is one of the most difficult realities of the case. The people who survived the events of Thanksgiving 2018 were left to continue living with their choices. But Kelsey had no choices left. Her future had been taken from her. Her daughter would grow older. Her family would grow older. The world would continue moving forward. But Kelsey would forever remain 29 years old, frozen in time. For many true crime cases, the discovery of victims remains marks an important turning point. It allows investigators to establish cause of death. It allows families to bury their loved one. And it provides a physical place where grief can eventually be expressed. Kelsey's family never received that. Her body has never been recovered. Despite searches and investigative efforts, no remains were found that could be returned to her family. That absence became one of the most painful parts of the entire case. Imagine knowing that someone you love is gone, knowing who was convicted of killing them, knowing the circumstances surrounding their death, and still not knowing where their final resting place is. For Kelsey's family, that is a reality they have had to live with. The legal system was able to deliver a verdict, but it could not deliver Kelsey. And that is something a prison sentence can never fix. When the cameras left the courtroom and the headlines eventually faded, Kelsey's family was left with the reality that every family fears. They had to continue living, but they had to do it without her. For Kelsey's mother, the loss was unimaginable. She had lost her daughter, a woman she had watched grow up, a woman she had spoken to only days before her disappearance, a woman who had once been a child herself. And now, instead of watching Kelsey grow older, she had to remember her as she was when her life ended. For Kelsey's family, the tragedy was not simply that she had been murdered. It was that they had been robbed of everything that would have come afterward. The birthdays, the holidays, the family gatherings, the ordinary conversations, the phone calls, the milestones, all of the moments that families often take for granted until they suddenly disappear. Kelsey would never get to see her daughter grow up, and her daughter would never get to experience the ordinary moments that a mother and daughter share as a child becomes an adult. That loss is difficult to measure. It is not one single moment. It is every moment that should have happened, but never will. Perhaps the most heartbreaking legacy of Kelsey's death is the impact it had on her daughter. She was only a young child when her mother was killed. Too young to understand the full meaning of what had happened. Too young to comprehend why her mother would never come home. As she grows older, she will inevitably have questions. Who was my mother? What was she like? What did she love? What did she dream about? What kind of person was she? Those questions will have to be answered by the people who knew Kelsey, through photographs, through memories, through stories, through the small details that keep a person alive in the hearts of those who love them. Her daughter will have to learn about her mother through the memories of others. She will hear about the woman Kelsey was, the professional, the daughter, the friend, the mother, the woman who loved her. But there will always be moments that cannot be replaced. Kelsey should have been there for her daughter's first day of school, her first major achievement, her teenage years, her graduation, the difficult conversations, the celebrations, the moments when a daughter needs her mother. Kelsey should have been there, and she wasn't, not because she chose to leave, not because she abandoned her child, but because, according to the evidence presented at trial, her life was taken from her. That distinction matters. Because for a child growing up without a parent, the story of why that parent is gone becomes part of their identity. And Kelsey's daughter deserves to know that her mother did not simply disappear. She deserves to know that Kelsey loved her, that she cared for her, that she was thinking about her future, and that her mother was a person whose life mattered long before she became the subject of a true crime case. It is easy, when telling a story like this, to become focused on the killer, the investigation, the evidence, the courtroom, the shocking details, the twists and turns. But Kelsey's story should never belong to the people who took her life. It belongs to Kelsey. Before she became a name in a criminal case, she was a person. She had a voice. She had dreams. She had a career. She had people she loved. She had a daughter. She had a future. And that future was taken away. That is why, years later, the most important part of Kelsey's story is not simply how she died. It is remembering how she lived. She was a woman who worked as a flight instructor, a mother who cared for her young daughter, a daughter who had a family that loved her, a person who had ordinary plans for an ordinary Thanksgiving. She was thinking about groceries. She was thinking about her child. She was thinking about Thanksgiving dinner. She was living her life, and she had every reason to believe that there would be another day, another holiday, another birthday, another conversation, another opportunity to watch her daughter grow. But there wasn't, and that is the tragedy that should remain at the center of this case. Not just the crime, not just the investigation, not just the conviction. Kelsey, the person, the mother, the daughter, the woman whose life was taken. In some ways, Kelsey's case has been solved. Patrick Frazee was convicted. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Crystal Kenney was convicted for her role in the cover-up and served her sentence. The investigation established what prosecutors argued had happened. The jury delivered its verdict. Legally, the case reached a resolution. But emotionally, Kelsey's family was left with an ending that still feels incomplete, because Kelsey is still missing. Her remains have never been recovered. And until they are, there will always be one unanswered question hanging over the case. Where is Kelsey Berreth? For her family, that question is not just about evidence. It is about bringing their daughter home. It is about allowing her daughter to one day visit her mother's final resting place. It is about having somewhere to go when they miss her, somewhere to stand, somewhere to remember, somewhere to say, "We haven't forgotten you." Kelsey's story is ultimately a reminder that behind every true crime headline is a real human being, a person with people who love them, a family that had dreams for them, a future that they expected to live. Kelsey's life was not defined by the way it ended. It was defined by everything that came before. She was a mother. She was a daughter. She was a professional. She was a woman with hopes and plans. And she was loved. The tragedy is that she never got to see the future she had imagined. But the people who loved her continue to carry her memory. And her daughter will grow up knowing that her mother was more than the victim at the center of a famous murder case. She was a person. She was someone. She mattered. And although the person responsible for her death was eventually held accountable, nothing can restore the life that was lost. That is the uncomfortable truth about justice. Sometimes, justice means conviction. Sometimes, it means a sentence. Sometimes, it means finally knowing what happened. But justice cannot turn back time. It cannot undo a murder. It cannot give a child back her mother. And it cannot give a family back the daughter they lost. For Kelsey's loved ones, the story will always carry that painful truth. The case may be closed in the courtroom, but grief does not follow courtroom timelines. It continues. It changes. It becomes part of the lives of the people left behind. And perhaps the greatest way to honor Kelsey is to remember that she was never just a victim. She was a woman who lived, a mother who loved her child, a daughter who was deeply loved by her family, and a person whose life deserved to continue. Kelsey's story leaves us with difficult questions about trust, relationships, deception, and the devastating consequences that can follow when someone chooses to take another person's life. But above everything else, it is a story of a woman whose life mattered, and of a family that has had to live with a loss that can never truly be repaired. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps the channel reach more people and allows us to continue telling these stories with the care and respect they deserve. Let me know in the comments, what part of Kelsey's case stood out to you the most? And if you believe stories like Kelsey should be remembered beyond the headlines, share this video with someone who may be interested in true crime and real-life investigations. Finally, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next case. Here, we don't just tell you how a crime happened. We remember the people at the center of the story, the lives they lived, the families they left behind, and the questions that sometimes remain long after the courtroom doors are closed. Thank you for watching. And until next time, stay safe. And remember that every victim has a story.